Hello and welcome to the 9th instalment of Society Language Difference. This week we're going to look at the unique and wonderful pairing of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. This is going to be an interesting one for us this week because we survived Derrida, didn't we? And we've been thinking and talking and discussing different experimental ways of presenting ideas, exploring new ideas. Anti-Oedipus, our text this week, is a very interesting case in point. It's difficult, deeply experimental, and it's trying to do something completely new about how we think. And maybe it fits its argument that in thinking, in thought, is a line of path, is a direction for revolution. But perhaps even madness, or madness of some kind, can also be deeply revolutionary. This will immediately have your mind thinking of the links that we drew with Foucault in earlier weeks, but of course, Spinoza from last week, the Spinozan turn. How are we going to fit it all together? Let's see. So this is our pairing. We met Deleuze in particular last week. Somebody whose kind of life and work is, might seem on the surface quite conventional. A university academic, specializes in the history of philosophy. But what he does with that history is remarkable. It's interesting. He completely overturns it. He even describes the way of the history of philosophy as like a kind of Oedipus complex, doing homage to the greats, reinterpreting the greats in a way that ultimately reestablishes their authority. Deleuze, as you will recall, is always looking towards creativity. Remember that book that we looked at last week? What is philosophy? Creation, process, spontaneity. These are all valuable things, important things. Guattari, we'll meet him in a second. So this is our agenda. The image on the left is these two. We're going to talk about how the pair met when Gilles met Félix. We're then going to talk about the problem of June 1968, which will come up as well in a couple of weeks' time. By this we mean the landslide re-election of Charles de Gaulle after the protests and riots of May 68. We're then going to look at how capitalism and schizophrenia can be said to be a pairing. This is the project of Anti-Oedipus and its sequel of a sort, A Thousand Plateaux. We're then going to look at the politics of desire, which is important for us. And then we're going to think about the legacies of this very interesting and curious book. Now, we'll remember from last week the importance of the encounter for Deleuze. The encounter being the moment or the process in which new ideas appear. And it's not easy, it's a conflict, it's a struggle. There's a wonderful line in Difference and Repetition that will get us started. Difference and Repetition, as mentioned last week, is a book that came out in 1968. And the late 1960s are Deleuze's kind of, there's a real moment of flourishing for him. The conditions of a true critique and a true creation are the same. The destruction of an image of thought, which presupposes itself in the genesis of the act of thinking in thought itself. Something in the world forces us to think. This something is an object, not of recognition, but of a fundamental encounter. Now, I know some of this material is going to come across potentially quite dense, and one of the things that Deleuze does, and he gets this from his master Spinoza, is taking what may seem fairly ordinary or commonplace words, bear in mind it's also the translation issue, but taking ordinary commonplace words and making them suddenly much more conceptually thorny, kind of difficult to kind of wade through. We'll try and get into this idea of encounter and difference as we go along, but just keep this in mind that thinking needs to be creative, it needs to be experimental, that thinking more deeply has to be something that is against philosophy traditionally. It must be difficult, it must compel new visions, new scenes, new ways of life, new ways of being to come into the picture. And if Anti-Oedipus is difficult to read, and it really is at first, then keep that in mind, that this is meant to be difficult. I know it's probably not much consolation, is it? It's like somebody kind of trying to force you to kind of jump into a cold bath or run up a very steep hill. But there's something that's exciting that's meant to be happening here, and it's about desire, and it's about how we understand the human psyche. So these are our pair. Now, we've already heard from Deleuze, but let's see how Guattari sees it. There's Guattari, I'm going to give you a quote in a moment. He's describing the writing process of these two. which it took the form of, writing lots of notes and exchanging them to each other over many years. There's a collection of Guattari's notes called the Anti-Oedipus Papers, which covers 1969 to 73, and it's just wonderful, inventive, experimental. Now the question is, who wrote Anti-Oedipus? Is it both of them equally? Did Deleuze come out with the best stuff and Guattari kind of spoil it? This is something that Zizek proposes. No, we need to see this as an equal venture and of equal benefit to both. Guattari, this is from a collection of his essays later called Chaos Ophi, like philosophy, but Chaos Ophi. Guattari, quote, "We don't claim to have written a madman's book, just a book in which one no longer knows, and there is no reason to know who exactly is speaking, a doctor, a patient, an untreated patient, a present, past, a future patient. Now, strangely, if we have tried to go beyond this traditional duality, it's precisely because we were writing together. Neither of us was the madman, neither of us was the psychiatrist. There had to be two of us in order to find a process that was not reduced either to the psychiatrist or his madman, or to a madman and his psychiatrist. The process is what we call a flux." This is the quote just appearing on the screen here. Flux, flow. This appears a lot. Maybe it's a concept that comes more from Guattari, who writes about it, than Deleuze. Flux, flow, you might be thinking here, history of philosophy buffs, of Heraclitus, the river. Heraclitus, a pre-Socratic philosopher, not much of his writing survives, just little bits and bobs. That you never step into the same river twice. That everything is changing, generating, being destroyed, birth and death. That's life. It's active, it's dynamic, it's driven by conflict, driven by flow. Guattari continues. Now, once again, the flux is a notion that we wanted to remain ordinary and undefined. This could be a flux of words, ideas, shit, money. It could be a financial mechanism or a schizophrenic machine. It goes beyond all dualities. We dreamed of this book as a flux book. You're probably kind of thinking, did you hear that right? Someone a bit earlier. There are obscenities in this, shit. There are references to the body, to sex. There's an interest in the Oedipus complex, the story that Freud tells about the development of infant sexuality, of male infant sexuality. But that story is thrown on its head in part in this book too. Schizophrenia, capitalism, schizophrenia. Yes, we've got more to say about this. And the links, you might already be thinking, how on earth can schizophrenia be something that anybody could responsibly endorse? We need to cover this. Here they are again. Okay, so this section 1, is about when Gilles Deleuze met Guattari. So just cast your mind back to last week and what was happening with Deleuze. He begins writing his works in the history of philosophy from the 1950s onwards, Empiricism and Subjectivity, 1953. Then over the 1960s, he produces a range of important studies of philosophers. There's a book on Nietzsche, there's a book on Bergsonism. Then there's the work on Spinoza. 1968 is an important year for Deleuze. In that year, he produces Difference and Repetition, and a very important statement for his philosophy. He also produces what is called in English Expressionism, which is a book about Spinoza. Both of these are part of his doctorate, part of condition of getting his doctorate in France, which is a more difficult process than it is in the UK. So these two major books come out in 1968, and with that, Deleuze gets a new job. Promotion. He's now going to be teaching at Paris 8, a radical new university, kind of college in Paris, which will become headed up by Foucault and involves a lot of people involved in the radical humanities in different ways. A lot of really interesting people are based there. In 1969, Deleuze produces a work, The Logic of Sense. That's another important one for Deleuze. And he also meets Félix Guattari. And Guattari is a very interesting man. He's a trained psychoanalyst, but he's very radical, politically radical, and radical in what he wants to do with psychotherapy. Anyway, this meeting of the pair is, it's an enormously important one for both of them. A number of major books come out. So we're going to be looking at Anti-Oedipus, which comes out in 1972, which is based on kind of dialogue and corporation correspondence from 1969 onwards. They then produce a book shortly after on Franz Kafka. In English, it's called Kafka for Minor Literature. And again, it kind of reads in Kafka a kind of subtle, radical politics of refusal, which isn't kind of based ostensibly in the content of his stories, which you might know, like The Trial or The Castle, but it's kind of in how literature and language is itself used. They then produce the second in the Capitalism and Schizophrenia series, A Thousand Plateaux. I'll say a little bit about that later. And then that comes out in 1980. Then in 1991, under both names, but pretty much written by Deleuze, is What is Philosophy? And we looked at this briefly last week in terms of the creation of new concepts. Now, who's Guattari? Okay, just go through this. Yeah. Okay, who is Felix Guattari? Here he is. Who is this man? Well, he's slightly younger than Deleuze, but not by much. He's born in 1930 in Paris, and he trains in psychiatry under Jacques Lacan. And he's a doctrinaire Lacanian at first. He's a committed Lacanian from 1955. So think about when we looked at Lacan and we looked at the ethics of psychoanalysis and the whole philosophy of desire. You want to picture and imagine Guattari at that seminar, and what that injunction meant, to kind of give ground to your desire, the importance of liberating desire, but desire not itself always not necessarily always being kind of for all a good thing to liberate, if you see what I mean. Lacan gives the story from Antigone. Antigone kind of has struggled to bury her brother, who's has been disgraced because of his opposition to the city. There's a power struggle. King Creon says, you cannot do it, and it becomes, in Lacan's reading, a struggle between an individual desire, a desire that's kind of wants to go, feels a strong sense of duty to what one deems is right, versus the morality of the city, the morality of the state, which might be a morality that involves hypocrisy or contradiction. That's the injunction, isn't it? You must, to give ground to your desire or not. That's what the analyst will do for the analysand, somebody who's the subject of analysis. Guattari's in that world, but he kind of moves on and moves away, and he eventually falls out with Jacques Lacan. He does a lot of work at this experimental clinic called the Labboard Clinic. Let's get off some of these details. And this is a place that it is largely a kind of a psychoanalytical institution, a place where people that are mentally unwell go for treatment. But what they do, there's a real interest in this clinic in group psychotherapy. There was already this interest anyway in Lacan. When during the Second World War, Lacan spent some time in England, and he does some work with Wilfred Bion and others who psychoanalysts who are interested in group therapy. So Lacan becomes interested in this. Now Guattari is very interested in group psychoanalysis, these group sessions and what they might mean. Why? Well, something that's going to come up in the reading, which is very important, is the ways in which our own sense of our own psychic experience, our experience of our own desire, our understanding of our own desire and who we are, is conditioned by our relations with others. We've seen this time and again on our course, this emphasis on wider context in Derrida, or social relations and our internalization of them. Think about Fanon and race. Think about Foucault and the ways in which power becomes associated with reason, who is reasonable and who is mad. In each case, there is this emphasis on relationality, and this is what we get with Guattari as well. So the clinic becomes, is kind of, there's a lot of group work, it's drifting to the left, and they decide that they're going to challenge the hierarchy of psychoanalysis itself. And the people in the clinic will swap roles, the doctors and cleaners, the doctor, the analyst will swap, take on the cleaning bucket, and so on. And the clinic itself becomes a kind of collective space. If you're interested in this idea, look it up, find out more. Guattari is very involved in this. Guattari is also caught up in May 1968. Apparently riding up on his motorbike to kind of see what was happening in Paris. He's also got a lot of kind of connections along in the radical left in post-colonial movements and so forth. And so when they meet, Deleuze is this academic in history of philosophy, although he's doing very radical work. Deleuze in Difference and Repetition has made a powerful case against what he called a generalized anti-Hegelianism, a refutation of Hegel. There's a challenge to phenomenology here, a challenge to structuralism, the idea that there are universal structures in language and so forth. Instead, our thinkers are emphasizing difference, multiplicity. They're not sure about Sigmund Freud and they're challenging him in different ways. But moreover, both of them share a kind of a shared temperament, a shared refusal to philosophies of death or those that negate life. Remember vitalism in Deleuze last week. For both of them, life and desire are so important, ways in which the agent becomes active and not passive in a Spinozan sense. You might want to think here too about the discussions that we've had with the Frankfurt School or with the Situationist International, what it means to have an active life, to live, to feel, to not be caught up in pseudo needs. Now for Deleuze, as for Guattari, this kind of critical work can't just take place in terms of a kind of workers' refusal, workers' strike. We need to go deeper. We need to go into our own mental internalizations of the world around us. When we think about mental illness, we need to explore what the NHS clinical psychologist David Smale would call outsight as opposed to insight. Outside being an understanding of the society and social relations in which somebody becomes depressed or anxious or unwell. Not just looking for insight at their childhood experiences, but looking at the wider world in which our own sense of self and power is conditioned. And this is what is happening. This is what is taking place in this pairing. Here they are. Okay, so in this part we're going to talk a bit about June 1968. I know we've talked about this a little bit already, but we want to frame this in terms of desire and reaction. So if this is somewhat new to you, my suggestion is to go back a couple of weeks and have a watch and a listen to the May 1968 lecture where I covered the Situationist International, Guy Debord and Raoul Vanneguem. In that we talked a bit about the riots in May and why the students were rioting. And of course it was very interesting that these disturbances begin they begin among university students just at one institution, Nanterre, in Paris. I think it's in Paris. God, I should have checked this. And the students' opposition and occupation of parts of Nanterre because the dormitories in which the students sleep are separated on gender grounds, and it's forbidden for the boys to stay with the girls at night and so on. This is about sex, isn't it? Heterosexual sex among young people. And so this is kind of, this kind of refusal by the university authorities, leads to outrage, occupations. Nanterre is forcibly closed, and students at the Sorbonne march in kind of, in solidarity. But then, this is the key thing, is the way, a big part is how the police respond. The police react in a very heavy-handed way to these marches of students. I think that it's the 10th of May, is a key date in this. And because of these heavy-handed responses, there are counter-demonstrations which lead to more rioting, fires, cars burnt out in Latin Quarter and so on. And it escalates. It begins as a student demonstration, but then workers get involved. There are workers' occupations at places like the Renault factory. This is like the main one. Apparently Jean-Paul Sartre, spoke to the workers outside of there. And eventually 10, 11 million workers go on strike during the middle of May. It's such a striking moment because this is a moment of refusal. I'm using this phrase refusal. You're thinking, where does it come from? Herbert Marcuse, I'm thinking here, One-Dimensional Man and Elsewhere. Refusal involving something that isn't just about strikes or protests, but is about a wider refusal to consent to an existing system of social order and economic order. The workers are on strike for many things. Yeah, wages, but it's not just about wages, it's about work, the conditions of work itself. Working too long. For what? For what in the end? Figures involved in the Situationist International had been involved with the non-test students from 67, I think. There's a work, I think maybe it's from 66, on the poverty of student life. If you're a student, I recommend you read this. As the students and workers, or at least the more radical among them, are asking questions about what is the point of getting a degree, and what is the point of us doing the same job day after day, week after week, 9 to 5, what for what? For a holiday 1 week a year, for a car, just it drives you to madness in the end. And so this is the refusal. But this is what I thought about a couple of weeks later. In 1968, Charles de Gaulle had been in power in France for 10 years. He was looking increasingly weak. He was, he's seen in some ways more like a dictator than a prime minister, because, his coming to power in 58 had involved the dissolution of the Fourth Republic. We call France the Fifth Republic, And the Fourth Republic, the official government and constitution, is dissolved by the military, the French military, because of their concerns about Algeria. So it's like a military coup, a military takeover, led by General Charles de Gaulle, in order to keep the war effort going in Algeria. Now, de Gaulle is looking very out of touch in 68. The students are rioting, the workers are refusing to work. And there's a period in which he flees the country. He visits the army, many of whom are stationed in Germany, to check if he's got the support of the military in case he needs to forcibly retake Paris. There's a lot of echoes of the Paris Commune of 1871 here. It seems that he does get the support of the military, but more important for him is there's a massive demonstration at the end of May against de Gaulle, but there's a very large counter demonstration for de Gaulle, and it seems that there is still a large degree of support in France for him. So there's a workers' negotiations around wages, the Grenelle agreements. Basically, the workers are kind of bribed to go back to work. I think it's a 35% increase in the minimum wage. But very cannily, de Gaulle kind of presents this as about law and order. Nixon will do the same in the United States. He says, well, what's going to happen if we keep striking and if the students keep rioting? Well, it's going to be a communist takeover. It's going to be dictatorship, a Russian takeover, an enemy within. And all of this works. All of this succeeds because there is an election in June and de Gaulle gets in on a huge landslide. So I call it the problem of June 68. I think that's a problem that Deleuze and Guattari, they're looking on basically, or they've looked on. And then in 1969, there's a need for new concepts and new ways of thinking to deal with that. So Nixon appealed to, I think it was the moral majority. De Gaulle appeals to the silent majority to defend the Republic against the communist threat. Back me or sack me. Now, one thing that you will see when you look at the preface to Anti-Oedipus by Michel Foucault, it's a great preface, is there's division and blame among the radical left. Foucault calls the French Communist Party bureaucrats of the revolution. They're not proper revolutionaries. They're against revolution. They want to stifle revolutionary desire through, top-down organizations. But not only that, there was also this kind of blaming of the French Communist Party for making the workers go back to work and for getting de Gaulle back in. I'm not sure about that, from a historian's perspective. I don't know how valid that is, but it reflects the divisions among the left at the time. And it also tells us about these new currents, what we're dealing with in May 1968. Hippies, the counterculture, it's a wider generational refusal. We talked about this when we looked at the Situationists. And this will feed into the new social movements, women's liberation, gay liberation, other forms of civil rights, movements like in Northern Ireland, that then take place into the 1970s. And these are sometimes presented as being against, against male-dominated, white male-dominated trade unions, labour parties and so forth. And so you get a lot of maybe depressing, new philosophical currents after this. One of them, they're called the Nouveau Philosophes, the new philosophers. What's that guy called? Henri Bernard Levy. We'll look at him in the final week and offers. People that would appear on TV, pontificating, your classic public intellectual, but were quite anti-leftist. So this is the question: where had the revolution gone? Where had those dreams of '68 gone? How come there had been this return to normal after all of these fizzy and beautiful and striking desires that have been in place? So I want you to think here with what we looked at last week with Deleuze in Spinoza's practical philosophy and the ways in which he talks about desires being co-opted later on. Let's just go back to this from, well, I gave you a quote from Spinoza's practical philosophy, but we then looked at something from Anti-Oedipus. It's pressing here. It's all framed in relation to Spinoza and Wilhelm Reich, two figures who've been important to us on this course. Deleuze and Guattari, quote, "Even the most repressive and the most deadly forms of social reproduction," if you're thinking here, what does social reproduction mean? It comes to mean just what you might think, the reproduction of society, "are produced by desire within the organisation that is the consequence of such production under various conditions that we must analyse. That is why the fundamental problem of political philosophy is still precisely the one that Spinoza saw so clearly and that Wilhelm Reich rediscovered. Why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? How can people possibly reach the point of shouting more taxes, less bread and circuses, and so on?" So these are the questions at play. And this is what we're going to use these two for. Now I want us now to just turn our attentions to the preface that Foucault writes for this book. And the way that Foucault, remember Foucault, we heard this beautiful quote last week where he says that, you know, the century, the 20th century, will come to be known as Deleuzian. Has it happened? I would say maybe Foucauldian. Anyway, so what does Foucault say about Deleuze and Guattari's project? Well, he's very, very complimentary. But he reads it in quite a curious way. He says that Anti-Oedipus is an ethics. It's a guide to everyday life. Now, what is this ethics and what is this guide to everyday life? Well, it's about power and fascism. Foucault is concerned that there are tendencies within society, within left-wing organisations, within all of us, that tend towards supporting and even desiring authoritarian structures, beings, wanting police control, wanting to subjugate others, wanting to hate, needing to hate. And this itself kind of often resting on a kind of deep paranoia. So this is what Anti-Oedipus is an ethics and a guide for. It's a guide to stop us falling in love with power, so that we don't fight for slavery as we would for salvation. Foucault says that the aim of the book is to free political action from all unitary and totalizing paranoia. Free us from paranoia. You'll see this a lot in the work itself, a lot of emphasis on not reactive desires, but active desires. And this bears quite a lot on Spinoza. It's about escaping the sad passions. Remember, the sad passions for Spinoza are so important. Spinoza, passions, affects, that's what he calls them, are states that involve either correlate to an increase or a decrease in our power of acting. So you experience joyous passions when your power is increased, but you experience sad passions when your power is decreased. You experience hatred, fear, and so on. But they can also perpetuate those. The point is, this is how Deleuze reads Spinoza, that there is nothing good about a sad passion, or very little good. And this is an emphasis that he makes. You might think maybe there is some good generally in something like fear. You know, we need to kind of fear certain things in order to not do stuff that would be unwise or stupid. That's true. But sometimes the crippling effect of fear on us prevents us doing things that might result in us being happier. Or us, doing or pursuing things, that we really want, but we think, beyond us, or we're not good enough for them. And so we close ourselves up. Fear has remarkable powers, doesn't it? So we want to escape fear. This is what Deleuze is saying through Spinoza and what Foucault is saying about Deleuze and Guattari. There's a particular quote I want to draw your attention to. Foucault, quote, "Do not think that one has to be sad in order to be militant, even though the thing one is fighting is abominable. It is the connection of desire to reality and not its retreat into the forms of representation that possesses revolutionary force." Now, again, you also think, God, this is enough a weird link now I'm about to draw, but there's something that bears here on an ancient way of understanding philosophy, which is philosophy not as the study of words, not as, a kind of a complex science of how the human mind knows things, but as a way of life. And this comes from Socrates, and you get it a lot in the Stoics later on. Foucault becomes very interested in the Stoics, and then much later in his work, we talked about this in the Foucault class. If you haven't seen that, just go back and watch it. About the care of the self, the training of the self. So what Deleuze and Guattari are kind of directing us to is a way of life that places, the exploration and pursuit, not of all desires, not of reactionary desires, but of liberatory desires, as something that is going to result in our own good. And it should be a practice, a process, a becoming. Now, one of the many things in the context of this book is the response to May 1968, which, for a lot of our kind of dramatis personae on this course, isn't always a great event. Althusser is, kind of seen for, not being sufficiently on the side of the students. For Adorno, it's even worse. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The students, disrupt his lectures so that he can't run them. He tries to get some of them arrested. Some of his female students, bare themselves topless, to kind of, challenge him, goad him. Jacques Lacan is, on the face of it, sympathetic, but he later on criticizes the students. He says that the students were looking for a new master. They were looking for a new form of authority. Now, this point is made early on a book that, not many of us have heard of in the English-speaking world, by André Stéphane. Now, it's not really by André Stéphane because that's a pseudonym. It's written by two psychoanalysts associated with Lacan, but not quite. They're members of this Lacanian, where I don't know what point he left there, the International Psychoanalytical Association. Anyway, so their names are Janine Chassiguet-Smergel and Bella Grunberger. And basically, in this work, L'Univers Contestationnaire, they kind of say, well, the students are actually Stalinists. The students want totalitarianism. They are, quote, affected by a sordid infantilism, caught up in an Oedipal revolt against the father. So the ways in which the students kind of playfully refuse to work, refuse to do anything, with this very utopian, idealistic politics. Well, really, it's a juvenile revolt. And not only that, it's a revolt that is ultimately kind of seeking, I guess, the overthrow of the existing order, maybe we could call it a social democratic order, in order to kind of, bring about something that would be far more authoritarian in the process. Now, Lacan ends up disavowing this. He says, this has got nothing to do with me. But it's interesting, this kind of milieu, this kind of finger pointing, of what May 68 means. Who's at stake? Who's to blame? And we'll see this, more and more in French society and French culture. Now, Foucault's got views on this, and this also comes out in the preface quite wonderfully. He talks about the three adversaries, three enemies, the enemies to the ethics of desire. You could think of these as the three enemies to Foucault's own project. We're not looking at it on this course, but Foucault's Discipline and Punish is a brilliant, wonderful work, 1975. That also should be kind of put within this period, especially the ways, and we talked about this in the Foucault class, that he moves from archaeology to genealogy, which doesn't sound significant, but it is. The control of bodies, we talked about this last week. So Foucault, the three adversaries. Again, there's a kind of, even though Foucault doesn't say much about Spinoza, there's a lot of Spinozism. Deleuze is Spinoza in this. The enemies are, number one, the political ascetics, meaning like monks. The sad militants, the terrorists of theory. Those who would preserve the pure order of politics and political discourse. Bureaucrats of the revolution and civil servants of truth. Wonderful turn of phrase. People that, you know, bring everything, you know, every kind of discussion about how to act, you know, back to a kind of a stifling interpretation of the right, you know, the right volume of Marx's Capital or something like this. The terrorists of theory, the bores. But it's not just these guys. Number 2, psychoanalysts. It's the poor technicians of desire, psychoanalysts and semiologists of every sign and symptom. This includes Lacan. This is an attack on Lacan, this book. Who would subject the multiplicity of desire to the twofold law of structure and lack. We'll talk about that twofold law in a moment. Then, of course, the final one, and this is a much wider and important thing on this course, it's fascism. It's the spectre of fascism, of Nazism, and the dregs, the residues of fascism in society subsequently. I mean, think about the Baader-Meinhof gang, the Red Army faction. Think about radical left-wing movements in West Germany. One of the things that they were alarmed by was how kind of people within the SS had kind of, you know, stayed underground in German society. There was so much denazification still to be done. The same problem plays out in France. Those who had collaborated with Nazis in different ways. That enemy's there, that enemy's inside us. And it's not just something that belongs to certain people that you might point a finger at as a tendency within each of us. That's where the ethics comes in. That's why Foucault talks about his work as a kind of moralism and morality. Foucault, quote, "Last but not least, the major enemy, the strategic adversary, is fascism. Not only historical fascism, the fascism of Hitler and Mussolini, which was able to mobilize and use the desire of the masses so effectively, but also the fascism in us all, in our heads and in our everyday behavior. The fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us." So this is the milieu of this book. The bottom left actually is an image of some demonstrators in favour of de Gaulle. So this is the world of Anti-Oedipus, the world of Foucault in the early 1970s. And in many ways, it's a world that we're in now. Psychoanalysis is, you know, has nowhere near the same cachet that it did when Deleuze and Guattari were writing. But when it comes to freedom, desire, power, and fear, have things changed? Let's get into the arguments of the book a bit more. Okay, so this is number 1 in a 2-part series called Capitalism and Schizophrenia. Let's look at the book itself. So, Anti-Oedipus, how is this book written? Okay, so it's published in 1972, but meetings and correspondence begins from 1969. What Guattari would do is he'd send very rough drafts, and then Deleuze would, you know, rewrite them, expand them, and they would, you know, discuss them and so on. The book is written in 4 parts. It ends up becoming a bestseller in France, which is great. The style, as you would have noticed, is very experimental. We talked about this in relation to Derrida, that there is this kind of influence of experimental modernist literature in some of our philosophers, in not just, you know, creating new ideas, but creating new forms to express those ideas in. And this is what we get in this book, don't we? It's, you know, it's kind of an avant-garde style, Dadaist. It's funny, it's rude, doesn't make sense a lot of times. It's audacious. There are no academic footnotes. The shibboleths have gone. The idols have been swept over. There aren't any, you know, key, you know, clear definitions at the beginning. This is an experiment and a journey in thought. Nietzsche is important to Deleuze, and Nietzsche is important in the background of this book. You've got a kind of synthesis here of the 3 masters of suspicion, as Paul Ricoeur called them: Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud. But Freud is criticised a lot in this book. Desire is at its very centre. Desire and what they call desiring production. This is a primary universal process. Just as you have will in Schopenhauer, and you have the will to power in Nietzsche, and you have conatus in Spinoza, so you have desire in the universe of Deleuze and Guattari. Desire is everything. Desire is everywhere. Desire permeates every social, political structure. Desire isn't just about this kind of longing, this kind of lack. It isn't something that, can never be fulfilled and is always elusive in the way that Lacan presents, although that's part of it. Desire, sexual desire, is something that's present in so much of what we do, how we move, how we use our bodies, and how we live. And the book kind of explores this in different ways. The book is anti-capitalist, pretty clearly. And a bit like in a way that Wilhelm Reich uses psychoanalysis to look at how Nazism could become so popular in Germany. So this book uses psychoanalytical concepts to understand why capitalism is popular, how it fulfills our needs or gives us pseudo needs in the way that Adorno and Horkheimer might set out. But this book goes even further than that, because whereas for our previous thinkers, Freud has been somebody useful to kind of think with, say Marcuse or Lacan or Reich, what we get in Deleuze and Guattari is an attack on Freud as well. Freudian psychoanalysis has been complicit in capitalism. It has propped up inadvertently an authoritarian family structure in which children from a young age are made to feel shame and guilt, to be ashamed of their own desires, to internalize a sense of inferiority and weakness, and this in turn props up the authoritarian capitalist social structure and hierarchy, makes us obey. Freud is the problem. This is the argument of this book. So there are some interesting kind of resources in this book. Spinoza is one. Antonin Artaud is another. Theatre of Cruelty. Henry Miller comes up at the beginning, the Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn, and other stuff, or kind of an American novelist. And the guy on the bottom left is Judge Schraber. I think that's how you say his name. As you guys know on this course, my pronunciation of everything in every language just sucks. Who is somebody that Freud wrote about. He was an actual judge in Germany, who ended up, suffering from what he called a nervous illness, where he believed that there were kind of rays, secret rays coming from God, I think, that were trying to forcibly turn his body from a male body into a female body. He basically writes about this, and Freud interprets him in a certain way, and then Deleuze and Guattari interpret him in another way. What you also get in this book, and it comes up near the beginning, is this kind of very playful style, which explores what desire might be like for, from our earliest childhood onwards. And this is kind of image of the little kid, the little boy, and the ways in which they don't see things that they play with or use as all separate objects. They see them as things that can connect to other things. They're different machines that connect to other machines. You might want to kind of think here of Jacques Lacan and the symbolic order, and how this is something that is learned through the fear of the father and so on. The symbolic order being the words, the symbols, the images, everything that kind of structures like a universal currency, our means of interacting with other beings. But what happens before pre-symbolic order? Well, what we have is the infant who is broken up into many body parts, and this sounds a bit weird. Pre-imaginary order stage. Think about the mirror stage, and mirror phase, I should call it, where a child discovers that they are a singular being, through seeing themselves in the mirror, and they discover in this moment, as Lacan reads it, that they are now separate to the mother. The mother isn't just a kind of part of their body that they cry and they can then use. But before that point, the infant had been made up of different body parts, different needs. And it's this kind of, exploded bits that then connect together in multiplicitous ways. This is the underlying structure of desire that Deleuze and Guattari have in mind at the beginning of this book. The desiring machines, bits that connect to other bits that do things. Desire is something that's always active. Desire is everywhere, they say, quote. It is at work everywhere, functioning smoothly at times, at other times in fits and starts. It breathes, it heats, it eats, it shits, and fucks. What a mistake to have ever said id. Everywhere it is machines. There's not one singular point, there's many points. So what they're outlining, what I'm giving a summary of here, is a very early part of this book. is what they call desiring production, desiring hyphen production. So desire is something that is productive. It's kind of produced in our interactions, it's produced in our feelings, produced, realized. Think of it like, in a way, as like energy. Energy is something that you use in order to do things. You express and exert your energy, and you also encounter the energy and force of other objects too. Now, when we're talking about desire, we're not talking about something that kind of sits within a black box, atom-like self, like of Descartes, I think, therefore I am. That self is not present. Instead, we've got a decentered subjectivity. What your self is the kind of the consequence of these many different things that you're doing at different points, and I guess your understanding of these things that you're doing. It's kind of process self, you could call it. So desiring production is unconscious. It's these flows of desire. You connect with other machines. Another quote. For example, the organ machine and an energy machine. The breast, the mouth, a machine coupled to it. The mouth of the anorexic. Hence we are all handymen, each with his little machines. Now it's curious to kind of present it, desire as like this in terms of these different machines, because maybe on some level that might explain what desire is like for you or me when we were aged 9 months or something. But how do you think of this kind of schizoid, kind of exploded sense of desire for us as adult beings? Well, maybe you might want to think about the things that you desire, need, and use, or don't use, as happens to you, throughout the day in different ways. How much of what we desire is conscious to us, and how much kind of appears to us indirectly? How, when we become aware through slips or tics, things that we say or things that we do, of maybe what our intention was and how we manage that in different ways, or how we don't manage that. The things that we need or want that operate on us or emerge out of us are often things that maybe are not transparent to us immediately. That's always a challenge to Stoicism, to any kind of philosophy that's offering a way of life that takes the view that our own thoughts and sense of self is immediately intelligible to us, in the front of our heads, that we know what's going off. What we get with Freud and what we get here is that actually much escapes the conscious self, and we shouldn't be looking for a singular self. Instead, it's in all these relations. So one of the things that I wanted, so basically the readings for this recording that we'll then go on to discuss it virtually in person is Foucault's Preface, and then it's just one part of section 1 of this book called A Materialist Psychiatry. And one of the interesting things here, that you'll see this on the screen, is this mention of Spinoza in relation to desire. That the ways in which Deleuze and Guattari present desire is something that is active, is flowing, is becoming. And they say, quote, the true visionary is a Spinoza in the garb of a Neapolitan revolutionary. Here they're alluding to a historical figure called Masaniello, who was a fisherman who led an uprising in Naples. Spinoza is a revolutionary. Quote continues, we know very well where lack and its subjective correlative come from. Lack is created, planned and organised in and through social production. Further, it is lack that infiltrates itself, creates empty spaces or vacuoles, and propagates itself in accordance with the organisation of an ordinary existing organisation of production. The deliberate creation of lack as a function of market economy is the art of a dominant class. Now you want to keep in mind here what we looked at with Lacan earlier, the morality of desire. He presented it in relation to Alexander the Great and Aristotle. Carry on working, work must go on. That's what's present here. That societies control, present an understanding of what desire is in terms of lack, of things that we need, of things that we are led to think that we need, the pseudo needs that the Frankfurt School and the situation is talked about. So lack and creating lack is important. It creates obedience when there are things that we are led to believe we need but are difficult to obtain, maybe because of artificial scarcity or something. Then we just have to go along with the existing social order. We carry on working, work must go on. Lacan makes a point beautifully, maybe something more beautifully than Deleuze and Guattari do. They think they're being more radical, but both kind of reaching the same point. Now, Deleuze and Guattari reject one key bit of Lacan on desire, and that is that desire is lack. That desire is a hole that needs to be filled in some way, fulfilled. They're worried about looking at desire as something that's always in need or always, in deficiency. They think that in some ways this would then correlate to a mode of desire that is unhappy, that is always disappointed, always spurned, always thwarted, is always unhappy. The effect of viewing desire in this way would be perhaps that we would just accept that the things that we really want we cannot get. You can't always get what you want. And so that might in turn make us more obedient to the status quo. That's why they're using Spinoza's concept of desire. Spinoza doesn't think of desire in terms of lack whatsoever. That concept doesn't exist to him. Spinoza doesn't think that free will is an illusion. We talked about this last week. Instead, for Spinoza, desire is something that all human beings have. It's what individuates us. It's what makes us us. That's not because human beings are special. What desire is something that exists in all beings, what Spinoza calls conatus, which is a simple and basic striving to persist in the state that you're currently in. A striving to persevere in being, as it's usually translated. To remain in the state that you're in. It's a Stoic definition, really. The Stoics say that all beings are characterized by an affinity with their own constitution. Now, all beings have this kind of striving, so it's not about I'm striving because I'm hungry, it's a striving because I need to live. And it may seem quite subtle, but it is important. Let's look into this philosophy of desire a bit more. So Deleuze and Guattari turn their sights against Sigmund Freud, as mentioned earlier, but also in terms of the Oedipus complex, the Oedipus story. Quote, from the moment that we are placed in the framework of Oedipus, the cards are stacked against us. Now, this kind of relates to this problem of lack, just mentioned. That the Oedipus, what Oedipus complex? What is that? Freud takes this from the stories of Oedipus Rex, a character in the Thebes saga. Oedipus is somebody who, the prophecy goes that he will kill his father and marry his mother. And so, his father, aware of this, I hope I'm remembering this correctly, when he discovers this, says, right, we've got to kill this boy so that this doesn't happen. And so, he's abandoned, but then he's kind of abandoned, but then he's kind of found, and he ends up kind of growing up with a completely different identity, not knowing who he is. And then, events, transpire, and then he does end up killing his father, marrying his mother. And Freud uses this as a way to talk about infant sexuality, infant male sexuality, hatred of the father, wanting to control the mother, wanting to be the mother's only one in different ways. Now, Deleuze and Guattari see this as something that's repressive. This whole kind of story carries within it something that might be, it's something that's inherently hierarchical. Probably it involves a patriarchal viewpoint as well. But it involves this kind of understanding of desire as something tragic, as something even dangerous. And then maybe that fits into maybe Freud's own slightly deflated worldview that you get, in particular in the book Civilization and Its Discontents. The distinction between the pleasure principle, the striving for pleasure, and the reality principle, where you accept that, that pleasure just isn't possible. Carry on working, work must go on. So Spinoza and Wilhelm Reich are important influences in this book, and they make some interesting uses of them. We saw that earlier in that remark about wanting more taxes and less bread, which reminds me of the December 2019 general election. We probably shouldn't go into politics, although we are about to. Let's just do it in terms of the early 70s. So what is the philosophy of desire as presented here? So desire as lack, this understanding of desire as being lack, is something that these guys say is mobilized by capitalism. It is, quote, created, planned and organized in and through social production. So what do they mean here? Well, hopefully I'm kind of giving us some leads. That pseudo needs, artificial needs are created to make us keep working, keep buying. A tragic view of human nature as something always disappointed, in pain, miserable, aggressive, nasty, poor, brutish, in short. It rises, emerges out of the capitalist worldview. It does from the 17th century. Think of Thomas Hobbes, who I just quoted there. That tragic view puts us off from wanting to change the system because we believe it cannot be changed. Capitalist realism. We talked about Mark Fisher's concept a couple of weeks ago in person. Deleuze and Guattari, another quote. Desire does not lack anything, it does not lack its object. It is rather the subject that is missing in desire, or desire that lacks a fixed subject. There is no fixed subject unless there is repression. Desire and its object are one and the same thing. The machine, as a machine of a machine, desire is a machine, and the object of desire is another machine connected to it. There is only desire and the social and nothing else. Again, I know some of this material is going to come across possibly quite difficult. Think about the creative, experimental nature of the writing without the ideas too. We're not thinking about one's own kind of private, locked away, sad self. Instead, what we've got are relations, connections, becomings, which can also be separations, schisms, scissions. At the bottom is this kind of universal currency, this energy, desire. Desire that can be good, liberatory, desire that can be reactive based on lack. There is only desire and the social and nothing else. Only desire and our relations. Of course, this is the backdrop, isn't it? It's a backdrop for this guy, Wilhelm Reich. Reich is important to this book, and Wilhelm Reich's book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, is a great book. I really like it. I think it's really useful. Yeah. So, what makes Reich useful? Well, it's this idea that there is a mass psychology of desire and the repression of desire. That the masses in Germany, many of them came to support Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and they loved it. They loved Hitler. They wanted Hitler. They wanted fascism. They wanted the boot down to stomp minorities. How could they want that? How could anybody want repression? Well, Reich's point, and it's a brilliant one, is that we need to be, less, naive or optimistic. That there is something within many of us, within all of us, which is, finds a lot of appeal in authority, finds a lot of answers to fear, and feels energized by the power that comes with uniforms, flags, and boots. Deleuze and Guattari quote, Reich is at his profoundest as a thinker when he refuses to accept ignorance or illusion on the part of the masses as an explanation of fascism, and demands an explanation that will take their desires into account, an explanation formulated in terms of desire. No, the masses were not innocent dupes. At a certain point, under a certain set of conditions, they wanted fascism, and it is this perversion of the desire of the masses that needs to be accounted for. So this is what we're dealing with, and this is where this book can be really useful for our own times now, for thinking about right-wing populism, which doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Right, let's keep going. This section pretty much follows straight on from the rest. So we're talking about the politics of desire. What I want to do here is kind of, actually I don't know why I made this a new section. My error. This basically just continues on. What I want to do here is try and fit some of the things that this book is doing, I guess within the wider project of Deleuze and Guattari. It's going to get a little bit dense for a moment. So there are some other important concepts in this book that I didn't say as part of the reading. Something you might have heard of before, or you might have read about. Deterritorialization and re-territorialization. So what does that mean? And why are these guys in favour of schizophrenia? We still haven't really explored that, have we? Let me bring some definitions up. So one thing so later in this book, Deleuze and Guattari look at the Marxist understanding of history, like that societies kind of change forms over time. We go from primitive societies, primitive accumulation, and we gradually get, from feudal societies into capitalist societies. That's how, Marx and Engels talk about this. It appears in the Communist Manifesto, and it's more present, I guess, in Capital. And what Deleuze and Guattari do is they kind of have something similar, I suppose. But instead of talking about feudalism, they talk about despotic societies. Anyway, what they do is they kind of take all this kind of, radical psychoanalytical approach, and they apply it to these historical developments. And Marx and Engels say that capitalism is revolutionary. And bear in mind that capitalism, in their analysis, it's got lots more advantages than feudalism had before. In the sophistication of production, it points to the possibility of freeing workers from work. Not all work, but a lot of work, a lot more work than they were doing in the mid-19th century. With that technology, with the remarkable social organization, capitalism presents opportunities. It's a deeply contradictory, inefficient system that, results in vast human suffering. That's Marx's analysis, and it still holds true. Now, Deleuze and Guattari also describe capitalism as being quite revolutionary. What it does is it deterritorializes it, to territorialize territory, to be on the map, to be on the earth. Capitalism takes things off the map, off the earth. Because what it does is it takes social relations that had been fixed. Think of feudalism. You've got your peasants, you've got your local lord, you've got your king, you've got the priests. These are social relations that are kind of fixed. They're fixed from birth. You are born a peasant, you're born a serf, and that's it. You're born, you're going to become king if you're the king's first son, unless somebody kills you. These are coded onto the earth. Now, what capitalism does is it decodes them. It takes them off the earth, because what we get is money. Money, gold. Suddenly you can become powerful, not through birth, but because you've got a lot of material power, I suppose, material wealth in different ways. That's deterritorialization. It shakes up society. You get the emergence of the middle class, the bourgeoisie, the city burghers. And that completely shakes up the social order. What you get, and this is seen in stuff like the French Revolution, is the decline, or not the total decline, at least not in a country like England, but a kind of decline of the aristocracy. At least in the way that they've been understood in the past, you get the decline of the church, big time. Monarchy disappears in many countries. But what you also get with capitalism is a re-territorialization. Power is kind of, flows, goes out, becomes something that's much more fluid. But then it gets re-inscribed, it gets, re-grounded in terms of the structures of desire and obedience, carry on working, work must go on, deferring what you want, deferring your pleasures, that prop up the capitalist system of wage labour. That's the re-territorialization. And more the focus of this book isn't so much on, being a wage slave. It's more about how family structures and understanding their own psyche and self end up reinforcing these social obedience, low expectations, a belief that this society is the only realistic one that we can live in, capitalism. So what about schizophrenia? How does that come into things? So in this book, schizophrenia isn't seen as as an organic disease of the brain. Like if we talk about schizophrenia, and you might have known people that have had schizophrenia. I have. It's a very distressing thing to see in people. It's a horrendous thing to see in people. So how is it that any book can responsibly talk about schizophrenia being a liberating thing or a good thing? Now, I don't want you to think about schizophrenia in terms of that, in terms of the image that I just suggested. Let's get instead the schizophrenic, the schizo, as they call it in this book, is somebody whose own sense of who they are within these wider social relations has disappeared. So just as a schizophrenic is somebody who can take on or dwell in different identities, different ways of being, so the schizo in this very kind of idealistic way is somebody who kind of decodes themselves away from capitalist social relations, social conditions. You know, they don't see desire as lack. You know, they don't see their destiny as simply to work, sleep, work, sleep, work, sleep, work, sleep, work, sleep, holiday, work, sleep, work. You know, there's a wider refusal. It is idealized, isn't it? Of course it is. But it's a way of describing someone who just doesn't take part, refuses to take part, is unable to take part in the structures of capitalism, which many of our thinkers on this course have opposed in different ways. And then the body of our organs, oh God, I can never even really explain this that well. It's something that comes up in 1000 Plateau as well. Still not explaining it that well, am I? It's something that they get from Antonin Artaud, and it's basically a way of conceiving of an identity, which is completely open to encounters, open to difference, and which is undisciplined, ill-disciplined, no longer a subject but multiple subjects. What does that mean? Let's look at an excerpt from later in the book, and then we'll start wrapping up. So this book is a challenge, and it's a refusal of capitalism in the ways in which it is inscribed or territorialized on our psyches. Deleuze and Guattari write, capitalism is inseparable from the movement of deterritorialization, but this movement is exercised through factitious and artificial reterritorializations. I know, it's sometimes hard to follow, isn't it? Quote continues. Capitalism is constructed on the ruins of the territorial and the despotic, the mythic and the tragic representations, but it re-establishes them in its own service and in another form as images of capital. All right, I guess I've kind of covered bits of this. The authority of capitalism. Continues. Capitalism indeed implies the collapse of the great objective determinate representations for the benefit of production as the universal interior essence, but it does not thereby escape the world of representation. It merely performs a vast conversion of this world by attributing to it a new form of an infinite subjective representation. Okay, that is quite dense, probably denser than I had realised. I should have picked a better quote for that. But what they're getting at here, and it has an important bearing and it's useful for us, is that capitalism presents itself as offering far more freedom than any society previously. We often get this in the way that capitalism is described in our own times. You know, it's not like living in the Soviet Union. It's not a dictatorship. You're free to live as you want. Marx himself in Capital talks about this as the double freedom of the worker. The worker is free to work for whoever they like. Great. You know, you don't like working here in this factory, go and work somewhere else. But it's not freedom, because the worker will starve, or they'll, you know, be thrown out onto the streets unless they can work, and work a lot. So they're free to work for whoever they want, but it's the double-edged freedom, because, you know, they're so free that there are no or very few social protections for them. Capitalism seems like it offers, you know, we get a lot of, you know, guff nowadays about creativity, entrepreneurship, this being a system that rewards innovation, premised on a liberal outlook. And don't get me wrong, there are many benefits to living in capitalism, but we're told every day that we're free. And yet it's the conditions and nature of work and how we feel about work which precisely inscribe our lack of freedom. This is why it was so revolutionary for someone like Marcuse to talk about refusal, the refusal of work. Same with the situationists. Yes, it is completely idealistic, but what is the alternative? It's this project that Deleuze and Guattari should be seen as part of. They also have some concepts that they come up later in 1000 Plateau to not be like a tree but like a rhizome. Think of like how ginger grows, or eyes growing out of a potato. You don't think in terms of one singular project or essence, but you think of sprouts sprouting out of many different points and potentially becoming more ginger or more potato eyes or whatever. It's non-hierarchical, and that's where their thinking is directed to. Okay, right, let's start wrapping up. So, legacy of this book. Well, surprisingly, or maybe not, maybe you like this book. I know when I first read Anti-Oedipus, I absolutely hated it. I just couldn't. It just didn't make sense to me. I found the the unclear nature of the writing elitist. I found it hard to understand that, and I found it boring. And a bit like with Derrida, it took kind of repeated exposures and understanding what the ideas were meant to do, and that really this book was meant to be fun, and I shouldn't be angry or confused, or I should be confused, but I shouldn't feel bad that I feel confused. It took this to kind of start getting something out of it, and now I think it is a great book. Anti-Oedipus is a bestseller in its time. France and Italy, to a lesser extent, America. They do this book on Kafka. It's quite a short book, and then the next major book is 1,000 Plateau, and it's a big book. It's written over 14 chapters, and it covers all sorts of stuff, like military theory, military history, just like geometry and musical theory, and it's meant to be a kind of a broad kind of cultural and intellectual, cannonball at capitalism in different ways, trying to present the conditions of a non-hierarchical way of thinking that is open to difference, open to multiplicity, flows, flux, becoming multiple, being a nomad subject, open to connectivity. I mean, maybe at root of all of this kind of connections, becomings, flows, is simply an outlook which chimes with the surrealists, chimes with avant-garde art. To make it new, as Ezra Pound said, to be interested in the new, the conditions of the new, to open oneself up to the new, in a way that Guy Debord and others talked about in terms of their processes of psychogeography, of the role of the dérive, of détournement, being open to difference. And this is what this book is trying to do. It kind of involves us to open ourselves up and read it when we read it, because it is so unconventional. So here they are. This is an image from Orson Welles' brilliant rendition of Franz Kafka's novel The Trial. It's more prompt for me to tell you about Kafka, but I already have. Then 1,000 Plateau. And then much later on, and this is a wonderful short essay, Deleuze writes postscript on the societies of control, what sometimes called control societies. It's a brilliant essay. It comes out in 1990. And what Deleuze does in this short essay is he talks about Foucault's understanding of disciplinary power. Now, Foucault here is talking about a kind of 19th, 20th century understanding of power through the discipline and control of bodies, in schools, in workplaces, in military barracks, in hospitals, the timetable, the rules, the uniforms. This is what power was like before. And what Deleuze does in this postscript is he says, well, actually power has changed in 1990, in the late 20th century. It's no longer about uniforms. It's no longer fixed. It's now flowing. It's now open. You're no longer working, it's not all the men, riding on their bikes to the factory, clocking in and clocking out. Now you could potentially be working all day, all weekend. Power seems more friendly, seems much more informal. But this is actually just simply a new form of power. We're now dominated through debt more than anything. This postscript is a really interesting way of trying to think about the wider ways in which society and work changed in the late 20th century through things like deindustrialization, which, as we know, affects the UK massively, but also France. Through things like neoliberalism and what that means, and a neoliberal subject. Take a look at this essay. It's really, really good. There's also a really lovely essay about the pair by Adam Schatz in the London Review of Books. And he makes an interesting point here. He says that actually all of this talk about flows and desire and so on, it's meant to be the language of the revolution of May 68, but it kind of tells us more about neoliberalism actually, which plays on these motifs of creativity and self-expression and breaking the mold. You might expect to see these on a Nike advert or something. Adam Schatz, quote, "It seems that the further their ideas have travelled from their roots on the far left, the more they have been incorporated by the system they opposed. Indeed, the language of desire, multiplicity, and all the rest is no longer the language of revolution. It is the language of cyberspace and of neoliberal capitalism. Deleuze and Guattari's desiring machines, constantly seeking out new sensations, look a lot like today's permanently distracted consumers and web surfers. Francois Doss, and this is part of a book review, is keen to portray his subjects as visionaries, but they anticipated a future neither of them would have wanted to live in. Now, that is to an extent true. They didn't want to live in the society that came about. But does that mean they are somehow complicit in the ways in which neoliberalism mobilizes desire? That seems unfair. Margaret Thatcher used desire very powerfully when she sold the idea of council house ownership. That there is no such thing as society, and therefore we are freed or liberated if our social responsibilities to others or our class, if that applies. So desire was powerfully used on the right. Doesn't mean that desire can't be a very powerful tool for political organisation on the left. And certainly this has been an avenue that people have tried to explore in different ways. Again, Mark Fisher, who we often come back to on this course because he's a fucking brilliant thinker and writer, talked about, in his very late work, Acid Communism, about what revolutionary desire on the left would be like now. Post-capitalist desire, he calls it in one place. Communist desire, he calls it in another. That we need desire for revolutionary agency. We want to talk about the emancipation of humanity or the working class or whoever you want. It begins with desire. That's what Deleuze and Guattari are arguing here. And that still applies. Maybe to a lesser extent in other works associated with people around Novara Media and Bastani, fully automated luxury communism itself. The idea of luxury communism emerged, I think originally, out of a dialogue between Mark Fisher and another writer whose name escapes me. What we also see maybe at the kind of the high watermark here is what Vincent Decoum calls French Nietzscheanism, like a following of Nietzsche in France. And this is a quote from Modern French Philosophy, which is a really useful book. Decoum says, quote, French Nietzscheanism claims to overcome the subject when in fact it suppresses the object, the city, that object common to those observing it from different sides. And I've basically got a cubist image here. It declares that the text has no referent outside itself, that the historical account relates no event exterior to the account, that interpretation has no bearing upon fact as distinguishable from interpretation, and that the different vantage points do not look out upon a world which is common to all perspectives. In this way, the single centre, the first principle, the sovereign identity are taken to have been defeated. We'll come back to this in the final week, how we fit Deleuze and Guattari with Derrida's project and others. Anyway, I think we've got plenty to discuss already. So this is what we're going to cover when we meet on Monday. I want us to discuss what influences shape Deleuze and Guattari in Anti-Oedipus. Then I want us to turn to the preface. How does Foucault argue that the book is an ethics, guide to everyday life? Then I want us to talk about desire and why desire matters. Then I want us to try and contextualize this book, in terms of Spinoza, fascism and anti-fascism, the Frankfurt School and anti-capitalism, May 68, and all that stuff. I'm going to do it all on the 13th of July. Okay, and then next week we're going to look at écriture féminine, women's writing, female writing. We're going to look at two figures who are quite different actually, who are kind of taking elements from this course, ideas from Lacan and others, but they're presenting it in relation to strands we might associate with the women's liberation movement and feminism. Lucie Irigaray and Hélène Cizou. And we're going to look at two readings. We're going to look at Cizou's essay The Laugh of the Medusa from 76, and then we're going to look at an interview from Irigaray's This Sex, which is not one, from 77. Okay, all right, thanks very much everyone, take care.